Good morning, everybody. Thanks for turning up in such large numbers. We are hosting today the IRIS webinar, which we've called the Paradigmatic Shift in Citizen Engagement. As you might know, my name is Willem-Jan Renger, and I'll be hosting this with Arno Peekel together. In this webinar from the Utrecht Sustainability Institute, and for myself from HKU, we'll share our knowledge and expertise about citizen engagement and how we developed this throughout the course of the IRIS project, which we will also illustrate through a number of examples of activities we have done in Utrecht. Cities in Europe and beyond have great ambitions towards a sustainable future, aiming to mitigate the effects of our climate change and to respond to the limitation of natural planetary resources. Governments translate ambitions in policy goals and transformation plans at district level, and implementing tangible projects requires involvement of stakeholders and citizens with a broad variety of interests. For actively engaging citizens and communities, it is important to take these diverse interests into account. In our IRIS project, an integrated approach to designing relational experiences for citizen engagement has been developed, based upon recent outcomes from design and system thinking approaches. This webinar serves to present an overview and vision on this IRIS citizen engagement approach and will be enlightened by examples and lessons learned. The IRIS citizen engagement approach enables cities to effectively engage citizens and stakeholders in transition projects, adapt levels of engagement to various projects and measures in the process, and acknowledge citizens' perspectives as expert knowledge to drive user-centered design. And we hope to encourage experimentation and innovation while engaging citizens in the process. So that being said, I think what we'll do is we'll share a number of slides, and Arno and I will switch roles in presenting those. So here we go. First of all, we like to have a sort of general introduction on citizen engagement and in its perspective. Because we noticed in all the conversations we had within the project that there are quite substantial differences between the various places that we have embarked on this mission. So we thought it would be nice to provide an organizer to be able to refer to this organizer in the various examples that we discuss, and also to relate to the various places in the IRIS project. So let's take this scheme as our organizer. And what we have done is to provide a sort of a wedge of 5 different stages of citizen engagement, depending on where a country comes from in its tradition, or what kind of measure we are discussing. So on the outsides, we were looking at the sort of extremes. So let's say on the left, there is a situation where there's an autocratic leadership and there's no citizen engagement. There are some places, unfortunately, on this planet where this is common practice. Whereas on the other side of the extreme, on the right, we are discussing full citizen orchestration, where there's a limited role of the government and a large role for citizens to decide themselves. And in between, we've got various stages of citizen engagement. The second stage is characterized by a situation where the government will inform the citizens on decisions taken. So this is the second stage. The third stage we would call a situation where there is a citizen dialogue, but often this dialogue is not symmetrical. There's more information or impact going from government to the citizen than backwards. The fourth stage is what we call citizen co-creation, where citizens can have a substantial impact on the plans that are being made or the measures that are being taken. And again, on the fifth, there is this almost extreme on the other side of the no citizen engagement, which is a very large control by citizens on all the measures. And if we look back at the first stages of our IRIS project, the ambition that is being formulated in the text of the call is closest to the fourth stage. So this is what we have promised ourselves and the world to try and achieve within the IRIS project. And now I'd like to hand over the slides to Arno.
Yes, thank you, and hello everyone, and also a warm welcome from my side, of course. If you can show the next slide. Before we dive into the topic of citizen engagement, it is good to provide you a bit of insight into the context of the Netherlands regarding involvement of stakeholders and citizens in decision-making processes. In this time of COVID-19, our national government gives press conferences every week to inform us of new insights and new instructions how to behave. The first press conference in March, our Prime Minister addressed the country with a statement that we are a mature democracy. He appealed to our majority by asking to act responsible. This is typical for the way we operate in the Netherlands, a mature democracy with great freedom. Freedom of speech is one of those freedoms, and therefore we have a long history of involving citizens. It is also a society where people dare to speak up, and believe me, they do. And that's also something we have to cope with within the project. Nonetheless, it is common to have participation and objection procedures in every vision, project, or approach of public authorities affecting public space. This is anchored in Dutch legislation and regulations. This has led to the development of new professions in environmental and stakeholder management. A lot of tools, procedures, and protocols for stakeholder engagement have been developed and are still developing. One of these tools is, for example, a market and stakeholder consultation as a means to collect input in, for example, a development of a new built area. A market consultation is published as a tender and describes the ambition a government has and asks the market to apply with a vision and ideas, with the possible outcome, of course, for the market party to apply for an order in a later phase. Here is an example, for example, from Utrecht, the transformation of the Utrecht Central Station District. The city of Utrecht is the fastest growing city in the Netherlands and has a great need for creating new homes and districts. One of these developments is expanding the historic city center of Utrecht to the other side of the train station. After decades of strategic urban planning and numerous moments of stakeholder interaction and different researches, the city of Utrecht wrote a master plan for this development. Part of this master plan is the input from citizens that was collected in so-called city talks. These city talks consisted of some sort of marketplace where citizens were asked what they want in this new built area. One of the outcomes was, for example, a new built park to relax and a nice place to stay. Another idea was to have less car traffic. And both these topics ended up in the master plan and will be realized in the coming years. At the same time, these solutions contribute to other topics like clean air, e-mobility, climate adaptation, etc. In the next slide, we will see that there is a lot to learn from all these projects and participation of citizens. And I can tell you, it's not all fun and games. Difficult topics like the expansion of Schiphol Airport or the CO2 storage underneath the city of Barendrecht or the implementation of onshore wind have quite some lessons. And every project or decision has its own characteristics and therefore needs for involving citizens. A flexible approach is necessary to fit the situation at hand. The tip of the iceberg of lessons learned. When someone is against the development, distrust will be built up quickly, despite good intentions of professionals. And what doesn't benefit the buildup of distrust what doesn't benefit the buildup of distrust is the lack of response or the slow response due to long procedures. And citizens often feel that they are the victim of the situation because they haven't been involved. And we have also experienced that the disbalance in costs and benefits doesn't profit a smooth involvement of citizens. Examples where citizens are co-owner of the solution have proven to work and benefit a better involvement of citizens. And finally, It is crucial to be aware of the right timing to involve citizens, and this has proven to be difficult. When you interact too early, the comment will be that the plans are too vague, and when you come too late, you will hear that everything is already decided. So, it is important to know your audience and to be precise in expectations. The citizen engagement approach we present in this webinar could help you to start off from the right starting point. So at this moment, a short introduction of how we work in the Netherlands and how we cope with the involvement of the citizens and how we put that into this project as a citizen engagement approach, which Willem-Jan will introduce to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arno. So what we'll now do is a short recap of a methodology that we have described in WP1, which is also available in Deliverable D1.7. So we're just picking up the highlights so that everybody has the same terminology for the continuation of the talk. So as we already described this organizer in 5 stages, for WP1, we set up what we call a ladder model. We'll briefly hit on some notes on design system thinking, which is underlying our approach. And we'll hit onto key terminology points that we need in our conversations, which is touch point and influencer. But first of all, part of the methodology that we described in WP1 and where we did some workshops in the different cities was related to the ladder model. And this is because not every measure in the IRIS project requires the same level of citizen engagement. So we try to come up with some tooling to make sure that everybody would pick the right level of engagement for the right measures. And this is also due to the fact that we had to describe and plan all the actions ahead of time because of the format of the European project. So there was ample time to ask citizens what they wanted before we embarked on the project, which is really a downside in this case. As you can see, the organizer that we presented to start with is related to some steps in this ladder model. And the 4 stages of the ladder relate to some of these steps in the organizer. So the first step in the ladder model was to inform citizens. There are some measures, and we identify these in every city, where a citizen will only be confronted with that measure at the time of construction, and after that it will sort of fade into the background. So level 1 is enough for those measures. And this is mainly due to the measures that deal with large infrastructural changes that become invisible later on. Even solar panels, once they are installed on your roof, you almost forget they are there, unless you monitor their results in your smart meter or something. So level 1 is to inform citizens, and level 2 was introduced because in the IRIS project particularly, there was a plan to involve some citizens as citizen journalists in the project to help bring the narratives of the IRIS project into the neighborhoods. So this was particularly shaped around an ambition in the IRIS project. Level 3 is where citizens can contribute to certain situations, which is, let's say, in the organizer, the 3rd step of the citizen dialogue. And level 4 in the ladder model was meant for those measures where the solution is not yet known. And we were, in Utrecht, we found that this could be applied to the smart street lighting solutions or some of the data services that were not planned in the project in detail. So wherever the plans had enough space, there would be the option to do the proper, let's say, co-creation with citizens. So this is how the ladder model maps onto our 5 steps organizer. A second underpinning for the whole idea for the WP1 methodology is based on design thinking procedures and methodologies. And this is, let's say, a full-fledged model on design innovation. But an important aspect is that in early stages of a project, you try to test and prototype your ideas before you embrace the full, let's say, classical deployment of a large plan. And this is where design with iterations in attempts and short prototypes is different from a more traditional approach. I can show you here a scheme from, let's say, a classical Prince2 based project methodology, project management methodology. And as you can see here, the red box on the slide is where there is a first encounter between the end user and a particular solution, which is in stage 4 of this model called transition. And it means that all the work on planning and development and investment in the solution is done before that moment. So if at this stage a user rejects the solution, it means that all the funds have almost always been spent. And this is a reason why many innovations in different areas fail. This applies to some ICT, large ICT projects you might know from the media, where multi-million-dollar projects are ending at an unsatisfactory stage in their development, usually because there is a late stage rejection by users because they were embarked on the mission so late in the process. A third notion from WP1 is related to touchpoint, and this is a very important notion because this touchpoint idea is where a user, a citizen, will interact or directly control a particular service. And wherever there is no touch point, you might seriously question whether it's relevant to do co-creation with citizens, because it might be an indicator that you're dealing with an infrastructural measure that will be, let's say, once it's being placed, will fade into the background of the conscience of the user. And there are several types of touch points that we have to hit upon. We identify passive points, and these are the classical, let's say, the letters you send to citizens, brochures you send out, info screens you might place somewhere. Those are what we call passive touch points. The active touch points are things that a citizen will directly control. So we're talking about an app, a web interface, some kind of controller, something with buttons on the screen. So a smart meter, for example, we would consider an active touch point. The reason we call the left ones passive touch points is because they can easily be ignored by citizens, a bit easier than the right ones. And the last rehash of WP1 involves influences. And this was a notion we brought about because, especially in our neighborhood in Utrecht, in Kanaleiland, but we know now from experience in the Irish project that some of our fellow cities are struggling with a similar kind of composition in their neighborhoods. If these are, let's say, low economy or neighborhoods with low social status, then we know that reaching out and engaging these citizens will even be more complex than in other areas of our cities. And we devised an idea that we might have to influence certain citizens through intermediaries. And these intermediates could be local people with informal power, so community leaders, or through friends, or through children if they are parents, maybe through active neighbors. So instead of only focusing on a direct approach, we were also exploring indirect influencing and strategies to do so within our project. So this concludes a short rehash of the components that we and the methodology that we described in WP1, as can be found in deliverable 1.7. But for now, we'd like to switch back to Arno and give you a bit of a heads up on our demo area. And it's maybe good to say that since these kind of webinars can be quite intense, we'll have a short break of 10 minutes midway. So stay tuned. Arno.
Yes, great. These are the few explanations about our district in Utrecht before indeed the break. Here you see the map of the city of Utrecht. Within the red rectangle, our district. In this district, we will implement all kinds of measures, like technical measures, but I won't go into detail into the technical measures. I will focus on this district from a standpoint view of the activities for citizen engagement. And as I stated in the intro at the beginning of this webinar, it's good to know the district and the people in the district. So I will inform you a little bit about our district. This district is one of the most densely populated districts in Utrecht, with over 8,000 inhabitants and a population density of almost 3,000 homes per square kilometer. It's a multi-cultural district consisting of mainly people with an origin in Morocco, 46%, and Turkey, 20%. And as you can see in this graph at the right, the red bars show that it is a low-income district, and that it is on this part also different compared to Utrecht as a whole. And then the building stock in the district consists for the greatest part of 4-story apartment buildings owned by social housing corporations. About 70% of the building stock is rental homes, and only 30% are privately owned houses. And over 90% of this building stock is built in the post-World War II period, when there was a great need for homes. And indeed, in this slide, you see that due to this need for homes, a building type was chosen that could be produced at a factory and could be built fast. And back then, the idea was to replace these buildings after 20 to 30 years with new buildings. But after 50 to 60 years, they are still there and suffer from a poor energy profile. And people suffer from drafty and moisty living conditions. Lucky enough for us, it is possible to retrofit these buildings to near zero energy standards. So in the next slides, I will go a bit into detail that in this densely populated district with a lot of backgrounds where people are facing high unemployment rates and low income levels, and living in a house with a low energy profile, you can imagine that it is difficult to get these people into topics like smart city or sustainability and energy transition. So on top of that, all the topics like low income, we also face safety issues and nuisance of, for example, rodents. And that make that there is a mismatch with the sustainability topics we aim for in our project. So citizen engagement is key in the demonstration activities. Without proper engagement, the sustainable measures won't last and won't be adopted, and leading to a disinvestment of our effort and money. After the break, we will showcase examples and conclude with common pitfalls. In the meantime, please type your questions in the chat box. We will address them at the end of the webinar or afterwards by email if there's not enough time.
So for this part of the session, we'll look at some of the examples, and based on the interactions we've had with a number of our friends in the various cities, we thought it would be good to dive into a bit more detail. So bear with us, this is more down to the nitty-gritty of how to do these kind of activities, at least how we tried, and what we will share with you is the approach, and also the, let's say, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the attempts that we have done, so that we can share our lessons learned and also the mistakes we made. So first of all, we'd like to take you to one of the earliest examples that we tried in our project, and this had to deal with the smart street lighting. In the project proposal phase, it was mentioned for Utrecht as one of the measures to deploy a number of smart street lighting solutions. And at the same time, the good thing was that it was not very detailed and articulated what would be done with the smart street lighting. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the technology, but it is quite a flexible technology. The smart bit means that these lights can be operated from a distance, but it can also accommodate for a number of different sensors that can be combined with the lighting function. It can contain sensors, cameras, it can sense the air quality, sound, detect movement. So a number of configurations are possible. And to put it in the perspective of our organizer, this was an example of the highest level for the ladder model, where we could genuinely interact with citizens to ask them what they wanted. So this is how we approached this in terms of its solution. We set up a series of meetings that was following, let's say, the design methodology as we sketched in the introduction. And the first stage was to invite citizens and ask them about a generic picture of issues in the neighborhood. It was not about smart street lighting. It was just empathizing, as we call it, with the citizens to find the right problems. So one evening, we invited citizens to come and share these narratives. And these narratives were combined into a series of fact sheets or narrative sheets identifying each and every of these issues. And a number of these issues were already mentioned by Arno, had to do with, let's say, garbage problems in the neighborhood, vermin that was attracted by poorly distributed garbage, road safety issues of fast driving, social security issues. So a number of narratives were combined. And then very shortly after this first session, there was a second session on the right in this graph, where we set up a series of groups of technical experts, designers, experts from the field of smart street lighting, representatives of the government, to make a sort of design teams. And we gave them all these narratives and said, can you come up with solutions, with concepts that on the one hand employ these smart street lighting technologies, and on the other hand, try to relate them to the existing problems in the neighborhood, so that they both combine, let's say, a smart street lighting solution, as well as addressing one of these narratives that were provided by the citizens. So it was a lovely summer evening where we sat down with, I think, was 6 teams of 4 people, 5 people, to come up with quick concepts, design sketches of what solutions could be done, basically using the technology experts to inform each solution whether they were feasible in the first place. And then, as you can see on the dates, a couple of days later, on the 26th of June, we had the third session where we re-invited the citizens and presented all these concepts in a pitch battle. And then the citizens were given sort of funny money to buy into the best concept they liked. And at a later stage, and this was much later because, as we mentioned earlier, these kind of processes take a long time, and not because people in the government are lazy, but because of the complexities of finding out suppliers of these technologies, finding out the feasibility studies of the solution, etc. So at a much later stage, we had a fourth meeting where we presented the citizens with a large map of the neighborhood, where they could pick the right location for the solution. The solution they picked eventually was one of the concepts dealing with road safety, and they picked a concept which was a smart street lighting road crossing, where the crossing point would light up in the darkness and would also inform cars that would approach the street crossing where they were driving too fast, and it would enlight the crossing in full light whenever a citizen would approach the crossing to cross the street. If we take an evaluation of these, then you can see here there was a number of good, bad, and uglies. I think we performed the whole operation from a design methodology process as an example of good practice. There was a very active participation of citizens and also a very positive atmosphere. There were some points, especially in the first and second stage, where we had to deal with a lot of prior negativity in dealing with the community council, but it was possible to take this away and turn it around. The bad thing was we found it very hard to find continuity for the participating citizens. So people that would show up would not always be the same persons that were involved in the first stages. We also saw that the length of the process made for a disengagement of citizens. So the people that were involved in the first 3 stages, where they came up with the design concept, were not the same citizens that came back to decide on the location. And it was very difficult for us to give proper feedback on the process, given its length, to the people involved. And we cannot even address the issues that we have through to privacy concerns to keep in touch with the same people. That is quite difficult. On the ugly side, we see that there are not enough participants. So the number of people that showed up was not what we hoped for or expected. They were not representative of the entire composition of the neighborhood. And yeah, they were not sort of engaged continuously. There was a one-off participation, but we could not keep them in a sort of active role throughout the process. But in the end, I think we had a success in the sense that the solution that was being picked was decided by citizens. It was an informed decision, and the concept was well established by the contribution of the various technicians and other stakeholders involved. So it was according to the book, you could say. What we also noticed, and this was not just because of this example, but of a number of other examples, in the way the citizen engagement is done often also in the Netherlands and maybe also in other places, where there is a tradition where the community council would create what we call passive touch point, let's say an evening somewhere, and hopefully attract citizens as a magnet towards that place and that evening to start engaging or participating. And what we felt was that citizens lacked intrinsic motivation to find the time and place and investment to come to these meetings in large numbers. And in our neighborhood, I think this can be easily explained, not because these are bad people, but because of the struggles they have in their daily lives that sort of are far higher than the agenda that we feel is important, dealing with the energy transition. So this generic model of creating these magnets and trying to get citizens towards you is something that we see falls below expectations continuously. And there's a repetitive disappointment where a lot of effort and a lot of care and love is being put into these sessions and the limited number of people that show up. The second example, which is of more recent date, has to deal with this. This is a smart meter called Tone. It is distributed by a Dutch energy company, and it can you can use it as a thermometer in your household, but it has a lot of extra capabilities, especially if you've got an online subscription base with it. So you can control your energy usage, like your temperature, but you can also program it. It will adapt automatically to have your house heated at the time you want. It can give you smart data on your usage on a daily basis, on a monthly basis. You can get statistics. Well, there's a plethora of functions, and you can also use an app to go with a smart meter to control it at a distance. And included in the app environment of this smart meter is also an embedded energy coach. And using the data of your energy usage through smart algorithms, it can detect certain pieces of equipment in your household and how they are used and whether they are energy efficient or not. Well, the reason to make a special operation around the Tone smart meter was this. A large part of the plan of the Utrecht demo area is transitioning these old these old apartment buildings and refurbish them to an energy zero state. But by legislation, we still need 70% consent of the inhabitants to agree on these measures. And for one of the apartment buildings, we did not reach the 70% consent. It was stuck on I can't remember exactly. I think it was 68 or 67%. It was very, very close, but we did not get the threshold, which was, of course, quite detrimental for the planning and the ambition that we had for the neighborhood, and a bad sign for all the other apartment buildings to come. So together with our friends from BOEX, the housing corporation, we came up with a new plan. So we decided to install the smart meter in the next apartment building before starting the whole discussion on the full refurbishment. So we offered the smart meter free of charge, including a subscription base for 2 or 3 years, which has a commercial value of 400 euros. And the aim was to establish a zero baseline measurement of the current data consumption in, let's say, the current state of the apartment buildings. But then again, we had the issue of how do we get these people to accept a free offer for a smart meter. One could argue it's an offer you can't refuse, but still we were realistic and skeptical in the amount of people that would accept it. We knew from experience that if we would send out a letter offering them this smart meter for free, the conversion rate on the letter alone would be very low. Think about 3%. This was data from Eneco. So we had to come up with a cunning plan to try and get these citizens to embrace a new piece of equipment on an agenda they are not actively pursuing, which is energy transition. So together with a number of key stakeholders, we set up an expert group consisting of the housing corporation, Eneco, the energy distributor and owner of the Tone IP. We had a consultant that was very well versed in doing door-to-door visits in the neighborhood. UC and Arno were present. I was present from HKU. So we had a very mixed group of experts to look at this problem. And we came up with what we call the Trojan horse approach, because we argued that once we would install the smart meter in the household, at least a citizen would be present and a door would be open. So we would have an opportunity to engage in a conversation with the citizen on a wider range of subjects like energy transition and the IRIS project as a whole. So that's how we set up a sort of cunning plan to seduce them to accept the meter, then get somebody internally to install the meter. And while the installation would take place, our consultant would also come in, have a cup of tea with the citizens and start conversing on a one-to-one basis. The aim of this operation, which sounds quite intense, is we expected a lot of disengagement moments per household in the procedure to get this smart meter installed. There were a number of critical steps in the process where people could easily disengage. So they had to consent on privacy issues, send an email, get an email back, then follow up a link in that email, then plan an appointment with the technician to put the meter in place, and etc. So in order to get a high acceptance rate, we thought we had to unburden the citizen as much as possible in accepting this free offer. And what we also used in the process is what we call the aesthetics cards to identify the citizens' emotions and how we had to respond or anticipate some responses of these citizens beforehand. I'll show you some examples of these cards. It's a wide variety of different positive and negative emotions, or aesthetics as we call them, that people might feel. And we used the expertise of the people around the table, especially the consultant that had the door-to-door experience, to identify the most predominant aesthetics or emotions she encountered usually when going door-to-door. And there was quite a hefty debate in the expert team in what we'd like to see in terms of emotion, but was factually encountered by the professional that we had around the table. And she identified a number of rather negative emotions when she usually had these door-to-door visits. there was quite a lot of mistrust or anxiety, worry, sometimes anger. They were not positive emotions. So we felt that we would do a good job if we could eliminate those negative emotions as much as possible through door-to-door contact. So this is a sketch that we used to draw up a sort of very detailed sequence of steps to eliminate these disengagement moments where people could sort of drop out of the process. Fix the dates for installation. This was late December, as you can see, around Christmas. Not the most ideal period to do it, but we were in a tight spot. So we would bring a laptop to the households, help them through the email procedures, get an email back, install, make an appointment, and then join the installer for the conversation once the tone would be put in place. Alas, despite our minutiae planning, no plan survives contact with the enemy. So, of course, when we started to roll this out, a number of bad things happened that we did not anticipate at first. So again, in terms of good, bad, and ugly, there were quite a lot of goods. So one of the things we discovered, especially the housing corporation, was that we were able to make a detailed social map of the building and its inhabitants. So we had a very detailed overview of the yes, the no's, and the why nots per household. And also, in the process of this, we identified potential change agents, people that responded very positively in the conversation, that were proactive, and were also willing to participate in, let's say, a committee once we would go into the process of getting the 70% consent on the major operation later on. We used proper design methodologies. We had active, personalized conversations with the citizens, and the building of trust was genuinely increasing. We also eliminated a lot of these disengagement moments in the process, and eventually we got to a 30% consent versus 3% just by letter, by sending a letter. The bad things, there were a number of hitches that we could not sort of envision beforehand. There were no power plugs installed for the tone meter, so an additional power plugs had to be installed. So the installment went from 30 minutes to 60 minutes per household. There was a hired installer instead of the regular one that was not as professional as the regular ones. So there were a number of downsides as well. It was also in its first incarnation a bit too labor intensive. So overall, there was room for improvement, but I think it was a major step forward from the experiences we had up to that point. So the aim was for a second iteration, and this again goes back to this notion of the design methodology, is that every step of the way you stop and see if you can improve on your first step, if you can make it better, smarter, slimmer. So what we identified in a follow-up session is that we had to adopt the process. So we tried to keep the best bits and eliminate the worst bits. So we came up with a cheaper solution through work students to do the aftercare, follow-up questions, any glitches afterwards, that we did not have to burden our expensive professional that did the house door visits with all the nitty-gritty. And also we separated the installment procedure from the house visit. It was not necessary to combine it and make it less vulnerable in the planning. We eliminated a second house visit that we had planned to revisit the usage of the tone because it was too labor intensive. And we also made a massive improvement on the instruction manual and the support material that we left behind to make the smart meter usage as easy as possible for the citizens. So we made a visual manual with as less text as possible because of the language issues in the neighborhood. 70% of the people in this neighborhood are illiterate, even in their own language. So a Dutch manual in itself with lots of text would probably not be useful. For the third example, I switch back to Arno. This is about the retrofitting of the apartment buildings.
Yes, Willem-Jan, thank you. And this is the last example we will show in this webinar. What I will tell you in this example is building upon what Willem-Jan just told about the implementation of the tone device. In this last example, it's about the retrofitting of these 4-story apartment buildings I told you about. And I will focus on the changes that have been applied in the citizen engagement approach, so not on the technical aspects of the retrofit. The housing corporation BOEX, who owns these buildings, has a long history going back to the beginning of the 20th century and has used different ways to interact with its tenants. A common approach to inform and involve the citizens when retrofitting apartment buildings that has worked fine for many years. But since several years, the interaction with tenants takes more time. And here is the feedback to the beginning of the loop back to the beginning of this webinar, when I told you about how the freedom of speech could also interact with your approach in your neighborhood, because tenants have more information at their hand because of the internet, and they also have social media at hand, which influences their opinion about plans. And because they are not afraid to speak up, they do. And then you start with a vicious cycle leading to mismatch in expectations and also discontent and eventually delay in the retrofitting plan. So it is important to have a good approach that is able to break this vicious cycle. And before I go into detail into that, I want to show you this. All kinds of aspects you should take into your approach when you detail it, like, for example, the language that is used in the type of meetings and who is the chairman of these meetings. In this table, you see all kinds of topics. It's very detailed. So if you have time afterwards to look into the presentation, you could go into detail. But what I want to show with this table is the last bit with the red square and the gray squares and the pink squares. As you can see with the red squares, these are quite small changes to the tactics of an apartment building that had enough consent rate to start with the retrofitting. That one at the left, the Livingstone 3. The second building, the Columbus 3, you see we changed a few minor details. So it's more or less the same tactics that was used in these 2 apartment buildings. So in the first, in the Livingstone we were able to start a retrofitting process. In the second, with more or less the same approach, we didn't. And different aesthetics and emotions played a role in this process, and also a different tenant population. So this is a good example that the same approach is not a guarantee for success in another situation. So with this in mind, in the next slide, you see that despite the same approach, the retrofitting of the second apartment building could not proceed. There was not enough consent rate, which is legally obliged. So it was time to evaluate and change tactics. So what we did, and that is shown in the next slide, is that the biggest issue that we had to solve is the lack of support of tenants. And the evaluation led to 3 main topics. We had to have a good story, we had to build trust, and we had to create a positive vibe among the tenants. And as you can see in the slide, we changed tactics a lot. And a lot of points like using different languages and creating more contact moments, but also an independent chairman for the meetings with tenants and using individual house visits to get in contact with the silent majority. The silent majority is the majority of the tenants that don't want or dare to speak up in meetings, but have an opinion about the plans. Involving and getting to know this silent majority is important in generating support for plans. And this is true for all activities with groups. So be aware not to spend all your effort and time to the loud minority that has a strong opinion, often against plans. The separate approach with the hamstone that was explained by Willem-Jan that had a good side effect. That it gives detailed insight in the tenant population, the social mapping, and therefore also in the loud minority and the silent majority. Besides that, it provides pre-selection of tenants that are interested to get involved in the retrofitting process. And in the slide here before this one, in this scheme, you can see that by changing these tactics, the approach changed from providing information to co-ownership of tenants for the retrofitting plans, plus providing space for their own ideas to gain support amongst their fellow tenants. And in the next slide, in the same table, I now have put in this table the apartment building that didn't get enough consent rate and the change tactics. And as you can see with the red font type, almost every aspect of the approach was changed. And I want to highlight the role of the tenants in this adjusted approach. It has proven very beneficial that the tenants organized their own meeting with fellow tenants to inform them about the plans. So they organized it and they told their fellow tenants what the plans would be and what the benefits would be, instead of BOEX doing the information evenings. And we are awaiting the consent measurement. The COVID-19 situation makes that we can't do the measurement at this moment, but the vibe amongst tenants towards the retrofitting plans is positive. And so we are confident that it will lead to enough support. And finally, and this is a very positive gain, I think, is that BOEX is also positive about the change in tactics towards a more co-created approach with tenants. And BOEX is already implementing and replicating this approach to other retrofitting plans. So we are very positive about involving the citizens in a project. And in the final slide about examples, I want to state that we showcase now 3 examples in this webinar, but we can show lots more. And in the next slide, we show you a sneak preview of the XR experience. I'm not going to tell anything about it because it's a sneak preview, and we will come back to you in another webinar or a meeting with more details about this. But as you can see, we've got an early prototype working. And other examples like involving primary schools to use the influencers from the schools, like the children, to their parents about the changes going on in their districts, but also the change agents, the social advisor, and someone with a great network in the neighborhood. They are the continuity in the approach by providing a familiar face in the district. These are already leading to more trust building in the district. And we will also continue to inform and educate tenants to use their tone device and become more energy aware persons that will also gain financial benefits from the device and being an energy aware person. So using the design approach has given us a lot of changes, but also a lot of good outcomes. And to finalize this webinar, Willem-Jan will go into some common pitfalls in this approach, but also in engaging people in your projects. Willem-Jan.
Yes. So for this last stretch of the webinar, we'd like to zoom out a bit beyond these very detailed examples of one particular neighborhood in one particular city, and look at the structure of how these negative emotions that we encounter regularly in our first contact points with our citizens, how they come to birth in the first place. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is partly based on, let's say, a tradition in which we operate these kind of large projects. And as I showed you in this graph earlier on, the point where the first encounter with the end users is in the decision making is often very late. And this is part of, let's say, the curriculum of a lot of project management courses in bringing the user so late into the equation. So if this is taking place where a lot of this decision making is done without initial citizen input, you are stuck in, let's say, the informing the citizen about what you're going to do, which is the second part of our organizer. Then the regular approach is often to create this passive touch point. So there is the infamous evening where the citizens are being invited, and there you offer them the prepared decision. But in many of these circumstances, there is, for example, little room for change on this proposal. There's so much work already being done that the amount of impact a citizen can have on changes for these plans is limited. Often during these meetings, formal language will be used, so the atmosphere is a bit impersonal and strict, and it leads by at the side of the citizens often to a perception of arrogance. I wouldn't say that the organizers are behaving arrogant, on the contrary, but the perception is of arrogance derives from the fact there's so little they can change in the plans. And this backfires easily on this prepared decision. So the negative emotions that are being triggered can often lead to a disadvantaged position towards the prepared decision. And I'm not that well versed in the details of all the different countries and their the rights that citizens have in these kind of processes. But in the Netherlands, as we said in the beginning, there is a lot of possibilities for citizens to object to these kind of prepared decisions. They can follow all kinds of legal procedures to go against the measures, and this often leads to delays, to increasing costs, or even to cancellation of the project. Not reaching 70% meant that we could not refurbish that apartment. So this is not an ideal situation. But this archetypical pattern is seen all over Europe and is somehow maintained in this way. And this is something we like to challenge, also to like to challenge in IRIS and see if we can make some differences to this. So if we do a good, bad, and ugly of this kind of approach, the good thing is it is relatively low effort in production and therefore seems efficient in place and time. But what we see, and this is not something that we get from the IRIS project alone, but this is widely acknowledged in many case studies and documents, is that it often leads to poor representation of the entire target audience. And this was illustrated by Arno in detail, that you've got a minority that's very vocal that will show up. And these can either be very positive and already they are early adopters, or they are the very vocal negative ones that form a sort of ringleaders of the opposition. So you often get an extreme presence in either the positive or the negative. But there's also limited possibilities for citizens to change or influence the decision making. And this has a lasting negative effect on the trust and the relationship that is being built between the citizen and the government. I like to compare this to the way a lot of modern online companies treat their customers. In the Netherlands, we've got some very successful online retailers, and they excel in, let's say, customer relationship. The one thing they do is to find a far more informal and personal tone of voice and touch with you, and also to inform you on every single step of the way of when you can expect your online package and when it will arrive, and if you were satisfied with it. So they're excelling in this sort of traffic management and customer satisfaction. It's something I think we can learn from if we take that to other domains. The other side of this coin is, and this is something that we've now experimented with in a number of our examples. If we take it to, let's say, the co-creation step in the organizer, and we try to create active touch points and to sort of compare the preparing the decision and listening to the citizens, then what the most important thing is that we try to create a realistic sphere of influence for the citizens, and that we make it very explicit what they can influence and what not, and try to make that space as big as possible within the constraints, of course, that we have. And what we have noticed also firsthand, it leads to less resistance and less anger and less distrust. And they genuinely become sort of more co-authors of the solution. And it leads to also to a modified decision. So it asked from us that we were able to modify or change our plans wherever possible because of the input that citizens gave. If we would not be able to do that, or if we cannot do that, then as you can see in the organizer in the bottom right, you go back to the third stage where there seems to be a dialogue, but the feedback loop from the citizen to the decision making is then too small. So what citizens then will encounter or will experience is that they feel that their feedback is lost, that they have given their opinion, but nobody is listening. So I think that this realistic balancing of input and output and digesting the feedback and genuinely listening and genuinely bringing this into your decision making is one of the major challenges of governments all over Europe for the upcoming period. And we know from the upcoming programs in the European Commission that there will be more and more emphasis on this particular point, because it's also underpinning the whole problem of the distance between the citizen and the government in a general sense. And many of our modern democracies are struggling with this increasing distance, and especially these factors like the resistance, the anger, and the distrust, as you can see in this scheme. Of course, the, let's say, more tangible results are that you might face less delays, less cost overruns, and less cancellations, and that in the long run might benefit more than the increased investment you might have in doing this approach. Because if we sort of summarize now the points for this part, what we are sort of identifying is that we are making a shift, a paradigmatic shift from passive to active touch points. And that is quite a substantial shift. It means it's more labor intensive. That is something that we have identified. It takes you more time than organizing an evening with coffee and cake to receive citizens. What we also have encountered is that it provides you with far more qualitative data from the citizens. It has definitely a higher impact. It's also instrumental in rebuilding trust using this empathic design. So these are in itself, I think, major stepping stones to a next level. There are some counter things that we need to identify. It is not an absolute guarantee for engagement. And this is, I think, key in the whole discussion, that engaging citizens is in a way something that has to be given to you by the citizen. You cannot own it, you cannot, in that way you cannot design it. You can ask for it, you can invite people, but they have to decide themselves. And the same applies to behavior change. Even if we refurbish all these apartments, we cannot guarantee that people will use it properly, or that they will change their behavior and take shorter showers. And so this behavior change component is maybe the biggest challenge for energy transition projects all across Europe, because that's in the end what is the key. It's not changing the technologies or changing the refurbishment of the houses, but the individual behavior in transport behavior, in energy usage behavior. That is maybe the biggest challenge of all. But you cannot get there before you have tried to engage as many citizens as possible. So this, in a way, concludes the information bit for the seminar. So I'd like to to close the slideshow now and open the floor to any questions or discussion that we might be able to do even in this large group, for which I would invite you to use the chat if you have any comments or observations that you'd like to share with us now. So we keep an eye on the chat, I think, Arno.
Yeah, there's already quite some questions asked. I was able to answer one of them during the example of the smart lighting.
Very good. Yeah, I could not interface with the chat or other controls while my screen was shared, so
that's
I'm on
fine.
the back burner there.
But Muriel asked some questions. You are from HKU are also working on the SCIS booklet. Will these examples that we showed, the practical tools like your design thinking slide and the tactics change from BOEX, will these be mentioned in the booklet?
No, the booklet is a product by many authors. So we have contributed to the booklet, and there are some reference from the booklet back to more detailed descriptions in our ARIS project. But they want one of the aim of these booklets is to make it very concise and short and to the point. And many projects are contributing to the booklet. So they decided to sort of use it as a point of reference towards many examples, but not sort of articulate all these examples within that one booklet because there are too many projects involved there. I think that the booklet tries the same as what we do with our seminar, is to bring a message on how you could look and approach citizen engagement in general. But I would say that for very more detailed questions or explanations, that it's better to refer to ourselves as partners in the project and liaise with us directly.
Okay, thank you. And the second question from Muriel is, what key performance indicators will be used for citizen engagement and co-creation in monitoring phase of the project?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not very well versed in the KPIs. I know that my colleague David is, I think, part of this seminar. I don't know if he can sort of chime in on this.
Yeah, what we wrote in the project plan. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Arno, please go ahead.
And what we wrote in the project plan was, in the beginning, is that we would monitor the number of people reached and the ease of use, for example, for end users of an app, or the increased environmental awareness. And these will all be done with questionnaires and Likert scales and that kind of stuff. But it is nice to take this topic into mind and maybe go one step deeper from the design approach. What other key performance indicators could we use? And maybe David, you can go into detail into that.
Well, not perhaps too much detail, but what I would just say in general is it's really very worthwhile to design KPIs for this type of work. It doesn't normally happen, and there are, I think, very, very few examples of KPIs for citizen engagement. But the importance of this is it allows you to be relatively more ambitious in your planning. And it also means that in order to achieve these KPIs, you have to engage with all the different stakeholders, the different organizations involved. And once a KPI is set, that is something you really have to strive towards. So what I would say is, in itself, a KPI for citizen engagement will help you to engage better with your partners and with the people you're working with directly. So it's something to consider. I think in the IRIS project, I think in the end we had 3 detailed KPIs, but we could also share them with you at another point.
There's still a question from Mona. And she says, how would you see the level 4 activities in the replication phase? The IRIS solutions are already in place when the replication starts. That is a very good point, Mona. And I would say that it depends a bit in how the replication takes place. If you would, let's take an example we gave in this presentation. If you are interested as a follower city, you're interested in smart street lighting, and you would like to replicate smart street lighting, there could be two ways to go about it. One thing is you replicate the smart street crossing that we developed for the neighborhood and place it in your own city. In that case, you would probably not do a level 4 activity because you already have a finished solution that you, so then you could have citizen engagement on, as we did, on where do you think this would be of most value in your neighborhood. So you do a location session, as we did, where you give them the map of the city, of the relevant bit of the city, and give them some parameters, and then let them figure out where they think it would be best suited to have most impact in the neighborhood. That could be one example. The other is if you replicate smart street lighting on a more abstract level without going into the detail of the smart street crossing, you could replicate the methodology we follow to come up with, let's say, an inventory of problems in the area, and then find your own design solution using smart street lighting. So even in replication, there's still a possibility of doing co-creation with the citizens. It just depends on how detailed your carryover will be from an example measure in IRIS to your own city.
Maybe to add to that, Willem-Jan, what you told me from the start from the project is to have the right expectations towards also the neighborhood and the citizens. Let them design what they can design, and let them not design what they can't design.
Well, I'll give you an example I witnessed in the Netherlands, where co-creation is becoming a bit of a rage in the let's all do co-creation, and they let citizens design a park in their neighborhood. And these citizens were, for a full afternoon, they were coming up with silly ideas, funny ideas, great ideas. They built play tools for their kids in a water venue where you could play, and then later on people from the community came in, and they tear apart this whole plan because it was unsafe, too expensive, it was not in line with European safety regulations, could not be done. So at the end of the afternoon, all these enthusiastic citizens that didn't have the technical knowledge to come up with the good solutions, they had created all these ideas and then saw them torn apart by an expert. And they were really, really angry, as you can imagine, because they said, why do you ask us to come up with ideas if we cannot do it in the first place? So there are many ways in which you can do co-creation wrongly. It's not a sort of holy grail in itself. So that is something to look into, and also involve maybe experts from a design perspective to get these kind of details right, because otherwise it's such a waste of good energy with your citizens, and it has the same counterproductive effect that we now know a lot of the traditional methodologies have. We are closing to 11:30, Arno. There's one question from Maurits still. Will BOEX as an organization change their way of working regarding citizen engagement? And how will they build a new model if that is the case? I think you already addressed it, Arno, in your description of the behavior of BOEX. Maybe you could revisit that a bit.
Yeah, what we saw was that it took quite some effort to convince BOEX to change their policy towards the tenants, and only after their own experience with not getting enough support for the second apartment building, and the experience also with the implementation of the tone, and of course other projects besides this project, they experienced that change in the policy would benefit their own process. And for example, a small thing like providing information afterwards a meeting was done in the beginning by printouts of the PowerPoint slides, and now they make a nice designed booklet for the retrofitting plan with all information in it that people can save on their table or in their homes, and they can read back. So that's just a small thing, and also the talk with the tenants in different languages. so not only in Dutch, was a major change for BOEX. So they are already implementing this in their own policy, and they are already changing their approaches with new projects in an approach like this.
Yeah. That I think we now dealt with the questions that were in the chat. If there are no new ones, I'd like to thank all of you very much for showing up and joining us in this webinar. We have a high turn up for the books and a consistent turn up, so we're very happy with that. It was a bit of a hassle with the slides, but I'm very happy that you stayed with us for the whole journey. And it is a bit silly to talk to 34 gray squares and only see my dear colleague Arno, but it is always a good face to look at. So thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe and sound in Europe.